The changes that happen in life are often reflected in technology that we use. And I'm not only talking about the synagogue and the way how we evolved, and now there are projectors and the live stream and everything, but recently I had to open a CD disc, and I personally don't have a device at home to open it with, and so I had to borrow a CD drive, and only to discover that a driver, a special program that helps it work, comes on a CD. And I think it's very symbolic in a way that sometimes we do have this paradox. And this paradox is, for example, about trust. Sometimes in order to trust somebody, you need them to do something so that you can trust. And it works also the other way around. In order for them to do something, you need to, they don't feel trusted. And I think it's very relevant for this week's Torah portion, and at least how I see it. And it contains probably this Torah portion. This week we read probably the most central text in the Hebrew Bible, the Ten Commandments. What can be more important than the Decalogue, than the moral basis for Western civilization and Abrahamic religions? And the Jewish way of looking at any text of the Torah is to read it slowly and to treat it as a carefully constructed text. Therefore, any word or the absence of the word should be there for a reason. This is why the Torah commentators notice that the verse that introduces the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, is the only place in the entire Torah where God speaks, but it is not clear who the speech is addressed to. Normally, the phrase would be, "Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe lemor," and God spoke to Moses, saying. So it says to whom it is addressed. That's the normal formula in the Torah. But in this case, it is written, "Vayidaber Elohim et kol advarim ha'ele lemor," and God spoke all these words. Who are these words for? Who are they addressed to? And different Torah scholars took different positions in explaining this ambiguity. For example, Rambam, a very influential scholar, Maimonides, a philosopher and halachist, the codifier of a Jewish law, he believed that the people could hear that God communicated the Decalogue to Moses, but they couldn't understand what it meant. So this ambiguity in who it is text addressed to meant that it was addressed to everybody. But then the question is, what's the role of Moses then? Why do they need Moses if God can speak to everybody? What's the role of this leader? And people try to reconcile this. So therefore, Moses was an interpreter. So people could hear God but couldn't understand the words. By taking this position, Rambam states that the main purpose of the revelation is not about God or belief, but to teach the nation to accept Moses as their only leader and prophet. That was a public statement saying that, you see, you don't understand, but Moses can, and therefore it's a public recognition of God's leadership. This was the best achieved by having the nation watch as God spoke to Moses. Another approach to the text's uncertainty is that God spoke directly to all people. And they, not just Moses, were God's audience for the entire Decalogue. Moses, therefore, didn't play any significant role. Again, we're here engaging with a debate between different scholars. One say one thing, the other say another thing. So Moses didn't play any significant role in the revelation according to these scholars. Like the rest of the nation, Moses simply listened to God and received God's words in the same way as others did. One commentator who takes this approach is Abarbanel, a 15th century Portuguese Jewish statesman and philosopher and biblical commentator. His view was that even physically, it was reflected even in a physical way, that Moses was standing with people and not higher up on a mountain. He was among the people. This view creates a horizontal structure of relationship between leaders and people, as opposed to the first one, very hierarchical. So Moses receives and tells people. Some commentators try to reconcile both views. So these are what I would call normally commentators of peace. So they try to say, you know what, you are right and you are right, and say that that it is maybe there is some middle ground in this approach, in this text. So they say that people only understood the first two commandments, and then they needed Moses to translate the rest. And this position actually is based on the text. The first two commandments are written from the first person perspective, meaning that, for example, the first commandment opens up with, I am the eternal one, your God. So from the first, as if God speaks. But the rest of the commandments, from 3rd to the 10th, are in the third person narrative, speaking about God and not from God's perspective. For example, you shall not take the name of the eternal one, your God, in vain. Not saying that, don't take my name, don't say my name in vain, I am the eternal one, but speaking about God and not from God's perspective. So, and the logical assumption is that it can only be an interpreter or translator who would say such things. So, and others say that everybody received and understood commandments, but Moses repeated them, each of them after receiving. So, in essence, the debate is not about the origin and purpose of revelation and Decalogue. I think that the key question is about fundamental, the key topic of this debate is the fundamental questions about our society and how we approach the world. Why would Torah commentators engage with the topic of Moses' authority if the only important part of the story was the text of the Decalogue? Before we can even speak about the 10 Commandments, according to our commentators and sages, and their message of morality, we need to establish trust at first. We need to establish, are we ready to receive it at all? This idea can be understood a bit differently. If you are in a leadership position, you need to ask yourself if people trust you before you're engaged in lawmaking, or deliver any message, or begin conversation. You need to build the foundation of any leadership of relationship with people. According to Francis Frey, a Harvard Business School professor, there are 3 building blocks of trust: empathy, logic, and authenticity. If you feel that the person in front of you doesn't act with integrity, or in Frey's words, doesn't act with authenticity, but I think integrity here is a better word, or doesn't tell you facts and truth, or in the words of Frey, not logical, or don't feel that they are thinking about your interest and well-being as well as their own, you are less likely to trust them. And at the same time, you are not empathetic to the other person, or not straight. If you are not empathetic to the other person or not straightforward, the other side is less likely to trust you. The missing subject, the missing word in the introduction of the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20, it's a reminder, I think, that before you look at the content, you need to establish a foundation for understanding for each other or a mutual trust. And it reminds me of quite an old and not very good, but I think it's good enough joke about religious approach. And I think it is about trust as well. Then a person is in a rush, being late to some important meeting and looking for a parking spot somewhere, driving, and says, God, please, I really need a parking spot. Please help me. And if you do, I will go to my place of worship every week. And then miraculously, a car pulls out right next to this person, and this person said, "Oh, thank you, that's it. No need anymore." And as we begin, sometimes I think that we live in a world that is more concerned about outcomes and solutions than relationships, more focused on national interests than people, on formality of agreements than building trusts. And as we begin this Shabbat, let's take a little break from the constant noise of big stories, solutions, and interests. I hope that this Shabbat will be a time for repairing broken relationships and establishing trust that is lost. May this Shabbat be a time for reflection and contemplation, remembrance and meditation, rest and peace. Ken Yehi Ratzon. May this be God's will. Let us all say,